Hello, everyone. This is the Outliers YouTube channel and our program Get to Know. I'm your host, DP Lyle, and I'm here with my cohort in crime, Kathleen Antrim.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be here. I am really excited to introduce our guest for today. And my mind's a little blown because I really can't even comprehend how this man shoved so much information into his brain. He is the foremost expert on Dracula and Jekyll and Hyde and Sherlock Holmes. And I mean, all kinds of stuff. We've got Leslie Klinger with us. He is just he's also an attorney. So I don't know how you do all this because what you do, Leslie, it's not like things you can just research. You really have to have comprehensive knowledge of everything that you annotate.
But it's kind of like being a short order cook, it's people ask me things and I say, well, it's in the book. It's like it sort of came and went through the brain and onto the page. I have been on panels with fiction writers who we've all talked about how much we love doing the research. And I always point out that I have one great advantage. Editors are always telling real writers that you got to throw away 80-90% of the research. You can't just dump it on the page. Not me. I don't throw away anything.
Wow.
Exactly.
Just amazing. So one of my questions, and one of the ways I like to start off the interview, is I like to just kind of delve a little bit into your childhood.
Oh my goodness. All right.
So tell us about, what your childhood was like and whether or not you think it influenced you becoming who you are today and, who's doing.
Well, thanks. That's a nice question. So of course it did. I mean, my mother was a voracious reader, and early on, my father not so much, but early on, I had a library card, and I was one of those kids where there used to be a limit of you could only take out 5 books, and the librarian said, "No limit for you, Les, because you're reading them all." So I would take out 10, 12 books a week or something like that.
Wow.
I loved reading. And so
What did you start with?
well,
What books attracted you when you were young?
in the beginning, it was everything, but then I started reading science fiction, and I had discovered some early science fiction, the Asimov and the Heinlein Juveniles, and those stick out in my mind. And I just dove into science fiction, and it wasn't until if you ask me what did I read recreationally through elementary school and high school, it was science fiction, even college. I mean, now college, I was an English major, so I was reading much more widely, but it wasn't until law school that I discovered crime fiction. And sort of I had a dedicated program. I was a good student. I was always prepared, but I had a rigid rule for myself that between 11 p.m. and midnight, I would do recreational reading. In my first year of law school, I was reading the magazine Fantasy of Science Fiction, which I discovered the library had a complete run, the Berkeley Library, and I was able to just sort of start with volume 1 and read my way through it. But in my second year, my girlfriend, later my first wife, got me a copy of the Baring Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes. And I read it and was fascinated and just hooked. And at that point, I said to myself, I need context. I need to know more about crime fiction. And so I read Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie and, a lot of the other, quote, classics to sort of catch up on crime fiction. And so then there's no looking back, So certainly the childhood reading was a huge step down this road.
Were you an outgoing child or were you more introverted? And I mean, I lived in books. I was very shy.
I think I was probably pretty introverted. I was one of the brains in the class always, and sort of sort of hung out with the brains. When I got to high school, I really formed a close group of friends, and I certainly did become more of an extrovert. I was on the student council and things like that. So it was a big change in high school.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
I'm sort of that kind of person. And Doug knows that since then I can barely keep my mouth closed, so.
Well,
Yeah, but you have a
me
lot to say. There is that. So, I've always been fascinated by, things like this.
yes.
I have the whole collection. I have these books are so incredibly well constructed. The
And
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes thing, I have all three of those, and yes, a couple of others. But these books are like medical textbooks. They're
Yeah.
huge. They hurt.
Yeah.
They hurt when you lay down in bed and read them. They hurt your chest. They're that big.
well,
But
it's interesting you say that, Doug, because the first series that I did was called the Sherlock Holmes Reference Library, and
Mhm.
and somebody said about it, "Gee, your writing style is law review,"
yeah.
and they didn't mean it to be a compliment.
Oh,
Yeah, what they meant was there are pages where there's one line of text and the rest of the page is footnote. So yeah.
so what made you decide that you were going to do annotated work? I mean, this
Well,
is a massive project. So
Yeah.
what screw fell out of your brain that you
well,
said I'm going to go do this?
This
well,
will be fun.
couple of things. I mean, first of all, I deeply admired the Baring Gould annotated Sherlock Holmes, and that was my entry drug. And I think I thought at the time, maybe someday when I'm old and retired, I'll be able to update this book or sort of do a new edition of this book. It was a mild fantasy way back then. But I've always been, and my wife will tell you this, I've always been the kind of person who sort of talks to the screen, can't shut up during the movies or the TV shows and all that, saying, "Oh, look at that. Oh, that's like this. Oh, look, oh, this, look." And it's sort of the DVD commentary track, that's
Yeah.
me in movies or television. So annotating is like that. It's essentially the same thing. Plus, I love trivia. I have a mind for trivia. Um, and so this sort of brought it all together. The idea that I could emulate Baring Gould's monumental work and bring all these other personal characteristics together, it just made sense. And now, I mean, every once in a while, my wife says to me, "When are you going to write a real book?" And and I always, first of all, it frightens the heck out of me. I mean, I actually did try my hand at a novel, which is sitting in a drawer somewhere, and wow, it was hard and totally different from what I do. When you annotate, I mean, the structure is sort of dictated by the text. I mean, I know exactly how to do that. Um, and so it's easy. I mean, it's easy in the sense of I'm not lost. I don't have to outline. I know where I'm going with it all the time. And it also breaks up into little pieces, which works well for somebody who's trying to practice law at the same time. I can spend an evening on a footnote,
Yeah.
Wow.
and
Wow.
and then move on. So annotating made a lot of sense to me. At some point, I got into these anthologies, which we'll talk about. But no, I mean, and you didn't mention a couple of my other major books either, which is we got Lovecraft, 2 volumes of
Right.
Lovecraft.
Right.
We have Frankenstein. There is, oh, thank you. I'm really proud of the book that won the Edgar in 2019 called Classic American Crime Fiction of the 1920s, which is
Mhm.
5 novels.
Right.
And I've had so many ideas for additional annotated books, but it's very difficult to market them to the publishers. Publishers are not, they have this stupid idea about making money.
The nerve of them.
I know.
Yeah.
So, so
Act
I've
like
gone
it's a
back to them with
business.
what I thought were brilliant ideas, and they've said, well, it's interesting, but the book doesn't really sell in the kind of numbers that we think that an annotated edition would sell. So, it's always a challenge. The next project that I'm working on is another one of those where it's like the project is kind of um, below the radar is maybe the right description. Not exactly going to be a huge market appeal, but I'll tell you why we sold it in a second. So it's going to be a collection of Lord Dunsany's fantasy work. It'll be The King of Elfland's Daughter, The Gods of Pagania, and a collection of short stories called Of Time and the Gods. And Norton's going to publish it. But why? Because I said to them, Guillermo del Toro is going to co-write the book with me. And they said, oh, whatever.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. 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 So I have a question. I mean, being such an authority on Sherlock
Everything.
Holmes and Frankenstein and
Everything. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is it about these books that you think is the reason why they're classics and we still read them today? Like, what really separates them?
Well, somebody said, and I think I quoted it at the beginning of one of my books, that, classic is a book that sort of never stops talking to you. Every time you read it, you find new material in it. You find new things that interest you, and of course, you're reminded of the good things that you found the first time through. So, I mean, these books don't need Les Klinger to be better books. I'm trying to enhance the reader's experience with these, but these are books that have already stood the test of time and are important for what they brought to literature. They changed things. When you look at the 19th century, which
you mean, for instance, this?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So the 19th century, literature changed in radical ways, and the huge, towering, iconic figures are Frankenstein, Dracula, Sherlock Holmes, Jekyll and Hyde. Those are the creations that loom over sort of all of literature of that century. And so, yeah, I wanted to examine them. I wanted to look at what is so powerful about these books. What makes them timeless? There's not one of the elements I think that makes them so classic, if you will, is their plasticity. That is, the figures, when you sort of scrape away the story and get down to the core figure in each of these books, the figures themselves are adaptable and can be moved to any time, place, century, continent, planet. So that we've had outer space versions of these stories and stories in the present day, stories in other time periods, and so on. And I mean, to me, these are myths. These are the modern myths, and I wanted to examine them.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. When you think about vampires, for example, I mean, we still have new vampire stories coming out today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Why? Because we continue to be fascinated by blood, and we're fascinated by death, and the idea that we can overcome it in some way. Does it necessarily carry evil consequences if we overcome death? Some writers want to go that route. Vampires are bad. Others have shown that it doesn't have to be that way. When you look, for example, I mean, one of the greatest vampire novels that people don't always remember as a vampire novel is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson.
Yes.
Which has been made into 3 different movie versions. And it's about vampirism taking over the world as sort of a plague, almost a disease, but it's really more a mutation. And the vampires are, in fact, superior to the remaining human, played by Will Smith in the last version of it.
Right.
They're the next step for humanity, if you will. So anyway, and the point is that that subject fascinates us. Jekyll and Hyde, I could talk about how we all struggle with what Stevenson called the war of the members, the struggle that we all go through to deal with the good parts and bad parts of ourselves. Sherlock Holmes is an exploration of the power of the mind, and is it possible with just your brain to solve problems in the world and to bring order to chaos,
Mhm.
and so on. Frankenstein is fundamentally about parenting and the critical role of a parent in that. And if you haven't seen it, by the way, I just finished watching Poor Things. Wow, what a brilliant Frankenstein story that
Hmm.
is. Uh,
Oh, very cool. I have not seen that.
yes, well, she just won the Oscar for Best Actress, and it's all on the screen. You'll see why. But it is a
Wow.
Frankenstein. It is a Frankenstein story. Absolutely.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's just fascinating to me. And you look at these books, or you look at Hemingway or Steinbeck and what have you, and you think, what really has separated those books from so many others and made them stand out and stand the test of time. So it's really remarkable.
Yeah. So for me, it's really the fundamental question about mythology and
Hmm.
modern myths. There's other figures. There's a few others. There's a really good book, by the way. I'm trying to think if I have it handy, called Modern Mythology or Modern Myths, in which the guy explores sort of chapter by chapter the modern myths. Frankenstein. He includes Robinson Crusoe as one of
Hmm.
the great
Mm.
mythological figures,
Hmm.
and also Batman.
Huh.
Oh, interesting. But not Superman, just Batman.
Superman, not quite as much, but Batman really he sees as larger than life and
Hmm.
logical and all that. But these are, I mean, human beings seem to need myths, and so we've created new ones since the first one is really well, Crusoe's a good example, but Crusoe and Frankenstein are two of the very earliest of those.
Mhm.
But
Well,
yeah, if you have
besides
time.
these mammoth undertakings of annotating these classics and all this,
Hmm.
you also have uh, edited and put together various anthologies. I know I had a short story in one of them, this
You
one,
did.
which I'm very proud of. But
Yes.
but you and Laurie King edited this. How did you come up with this whole series of stories inspired by Sherlock Holmes? I mean, obviously you have a great love for him and a great
Yes, but
knowledge for him, but what a great idea.
it was a fortuitous thing, Doug. What happened was Lori and I were, as usual, tagged to do a Sherlock Holmes panel. This was for a Left Coast Crime Conference. And
Hmm.
the organizer asked us, who else do you want on the panel? And we looked at the attendees and I said, Jan Burke, Lee Child, and Michael Connolly. And they said, well, those are our guests of honor. You can't have them all on one panel. I said, well, but we're going to talk about Sherlock Holmes.
Hmm.
And so it's not going to be about them being sort of guests of honor. I know nobody knows that they love Sherlock Holmes, but I do. I happen to know that each one of them has an affinity for Holmes. And so we did this panel and it was incredible. Every one of I mean, Michael Connolly would say, well, I don't really know much about Sherlock Holmes, and then have wonderful insights about the stories. The child, the same thing, all three of them. So after the panel was over, I said to Lori, wouldn't it be fun if they wrote some stories for us? And we put together an anthology. And we did. And Lee and Jan were in the first one. Neil Gaiman was in the first one. Once Neil signed on, it was really easy to get everybody else to sign on. But and Michael wrote a story for the second anthology we did. Um,
Hmm.
and it's been so much fun. There are now 75 writers in our little gang of
Hmm.
people who have written for these anthologies.
Wow.
And every one of them an A-lister, including Doug. Uh, and it's just been such a treat when the stories come rolling in and we get to read them. It's like, wow, we have never told anybody what to write. Um, and we've never taken an unsolicited submission. We've basically gone to the writers and said, Doug, would you write us a story? Uh,
Yeah.
and we've been, you pointed out correctly, Doug, that we've tried to say very clearly, we're not asking you to write a Sherlock Holmes story. We're asking you to write something inspired by Holmes. So it could be a modern story, a Victorian story. It could be one of the characters in Holmes. It could be somebody sort of like Holmes. Um, and the variety has been incredible. Early on, we also had Colin Cotterill, who I don't know if you guys know Colin. He's a very funny writer, lives in Thailand and writes a wonderful series of mysteries. And he was one of the first contributors. And Laurie had seen that he had done some illustrations for some of his books, sort of cartoon illustrations.
Mhm.
And she said to Colin, why don't we use a couple of them? And he jumped into it and wrote an entire comic book. He wrote basically a graphic story.
Oh my gosh.
And so
Yeah.
we put that in the book. And subsequently, every volume has had a graphic story as well as a. So Joe Hill gave us one for the last volume we did. We've had just wonderful people contributing. So anyway, it's just been great fun. But so those are what I call live people anthologies. And we've done, I think, 6 of those, 5 or 6 of those by now. I've also done more than a half dozen dead people anthologies. Now those are different in that, first of all, they're easier. The writers never talk back. They're on time, they get their work in on time.
And there's no editing involved.
There's no editing.
No editing.
Well,
Right, right.
there is a different kind of editing involved.
Right.
Yes. So I started doing that myself with a series that I called the In the Shadow series. So I did a couple of anthologies. The first one was called In the Shadow of Sherlock Holmes. The next one was called In the Shadow of Dracula. I did one called In the Shadow of Agatha Christie and In the Shadow of Edgar Allan Poe. And the shadow idea was these were contemporary writers of those writers that had gotten lost in the shadow because these other writers, Poe, Christie, etc., were such huge successes that the others got sort of left behind. They didn't get the attention they deserved. So those were a lot of fun. And then one day I was talking to my friend Lisa Morton, and we had the idea of doing more of that together. And so we've done 4 anthologies together, 2 volumes of we called Weird Women, which are women writers of horror / weird fiction.
Mhm.
And we did one called Ghost Stories, clever title, and one called Haunted Tales. And these are, again, sort of dead
Mhm.
people anthologies, classic stories along these themes of horror and the supernatural. And I love doing that. I love bringing back into focus these writers and these works. Now, you can see from the cover here, these writers are big name writers.
Yes.
Right.
Conan Doyle, Oscar Wilde, etc. But people have forgotten that they also wrote ghost stories.
Yeah.
And so
Wow.
they're wonderful stories. And so we've made some deep dives into the 19th century and the rich literature of that period.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So what are you
Just-
working on now?
Well, so I mentioned the Dunsany book, but I've also taken on, because I love it, the editorship of the Library of Congress Crime Classics series. So this series was the invention of Barbara Peters, friend Barbara, who runs the Poison Pen Bookshop and who used to run the Poison Pen Press till she sold it. So Barbara was distributing the British Library Crime Classics series at the store, which is what it sounds like,
Mhm.
and was annoyed that it was only the Brits. And she said, let's go, Les, to the Library of Congress and talk to them about doing an American series. So she and her husband, Rob, who was the publisher of the Poison Pen Press, and I flew to Washington, met with the publishing office. I didn't even know there was one.
I didn't know that. Wow.
The Library of Congress, and pitched them this idea, and they loved it. And so it started in 2021. We're up to 17 titles now. So
Wow.
we did 6 the first year, 6 the next year, 4 the following year, which was last year, and the 17th has just come out. So that takes me back to 2021. Yes. And we've spanned from 1866, The Dead Letter by Seeley Register, the first American mystery novel, all the way up to 1961, Case Pending by Del Shannon, and sort of lots of things in between. These are lightly annotated editions. They come out in trade paperback. They have notes. They have an introduction to put the book into context and sort of why is it in the series. A biography of the author, suggested further reading, and discussion group questions. And they've been tremendous fun to do. I'm always annoyed by the reviews, which go on to say wonderful things about the books. It's like, of course they say wonderful things about the books. That's why they're in the series. And they maybe mention that I edited them and added a few notes. Maybe. Mostly they don't bother doing that. But that's okay.
Clearly their priorities are not aligned.
That's
Yes.
right. But I mean, they're right. These are marvelous books, and they're books that are important to the genre. But we've also, I mean, we're not picking up titles that you would, the Leavenworth Case is not in the series because there's bunches of editions of it. And so we're not reprinting books that are already widely available. We're trying to find the ones that have either sort of slipped out of view or slipped out of print. Some of them are public domain. Maybe half are public domain. The other half are still under copyright. The Librarian of Congress has written a short preface to them, but I write the introduction pretty much every time. And so they're wonderful fun to do. We have tried very hard not to be politically correct. We are not editing these books to remove offensive words and things. I mean, obviously, we're gonna
thank you for that.
Yes, well, we're going to leave out books that are really offensive.
Sure.
And we have rejected some as being offensive. That they're sort of they're just too dated, or they're boring. That's another reason they're not going to make this series.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to include books that have, well, I don't know, that reflect the time periods.
Right. In our history.
Yeah. So if there's an occasional bad word, it's because it wasn't really a bad word at the time. For example, one of the next books that's coming out, it's not yet out, is David Dodge's To Catch a Thief, the basis for the Cary Grant movie, and it has a reference to a dirty gypsy. Well, now we're more enlightened and we don't talk the Roma as dirty gypsies anymore. But in 1945, and maybe still, there was deep prejudice against the Roma in France. And so I have a long footnote in the book, sort of talking about the prejudices. But that's not a reason to take the book out of the series. So
I completely agree, because I think that there's things like that are important for us to remember. To be enlightened, and otherwise
context is everything. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, in my classic American crime fiction book, for example, one of the novels is the first Charlie Chan mystery, and it takes place in Honolulu, where there was a significant. There were basically three populations there, four. There were indigenous people, there were whites who had come from the East Coast to settle there. There was a large Japanese colony and a small Chinese colony. The Japanese and the Chinese did not get along well. And this was also a time when we had enforced the Johnson Act, which imposed quotas on immigration. And the quota for Asian immigrants into the United States was 0. So this was a good time to be a person, an Asian, to be a person of that color, or of any color for that matter, but to be of that color in the United States. And so I talked about that a lot in the footnotes, but that was not a reason in my mind to leave the book out.
Right.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Leslie Klinger, this has been fantastic. You are a great interview, and we've got to have you back because you are just such a wealth of knowledge.
Yeah.
Seriously, I mean, it just blows my mind. So thank you. And
My pleasure.
when these next books come out, keep us posted so we can grab you back on here.
Absolutely. Well, the
and
Library of Congress series is coming out quarterly, so you can look for those. And
Oh, great. Okay.
and we will post your website so people can go there and look at all these books and really look at some of these annotated classics. I mean, they're just so well done and
Thank
so
you.
much fun to read because you see those stories that you read a long time ago in a whole different light.
Well,
Yeah.
that's what I try for. That's what
Yeah, well, it worked. Are
good.
we going to see you at any conferences soon?
Yes, I will. First of all, be at the Edgars. I will be at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, moderating a panel on horror,
Mhm.
and BoucherCon for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome.
BoucherCon. We'll do dinner. I love BoucherCon. Yeah,
Great.
we'll be there. All right, my friend. Thank you for being with us, and our paths will cross face to face soon. It's been too long.
Great.
And I just want to remind our viewers to please click the thumbs up. It helps with the algorithms, gets the interviews out, and also subscribe so we can bring you a lot more of these great interviews.
And thank everyone for being here at the Outliers YouTube channel and our Get to Know. And we thank Les for being here and sharing his wonderful face and knowledge with us. We had such a good time.
Absolutely.
Take care.